Chapter 11, Gideon's Discipline, from Judges chapter 8, verses 14 through 21. On the way back to the Jordan and their homes to the west of it, Gideon's men captured a young man from Succoth. This turned out to be a remarkable windfall. It was not just happenstance or coincidence. Like so many of the amazing things which had taken place with lightning-like rapidity in his meteoric career, it was arranged and ordained of Yahuwah. This youthful captive was no nondescript cast-off from the community of Succoth. Quite the reverse. He was one of the key people there. With his extensive knowledge of all its inhabitants, he was able to describe to Gideon in minute and exact detail the names and residences of all 77 of the community leaders. This inside information that fell into Gideon's hands was precisely what he needed. It would enable him to sort out the princes, leaders, and other hierarchy of Succoth who had so blatantly refused him supplies. Undoubtedly, they would have been some of the common people who might have given his armed men food and refreshment to carry them to battle with the enemy. But it was their leaders who had taunted Gideon to provide them with tangible proof that he would ultimately be the victor. These 77 men were the moving force who influenced all their people to have no faith, either in Gideon's cause or in Yahuwah of Yasharel. That this could be so is all the more amazing when one stops to consider that some 120,000 of the Midianite forces had been slain in battle before even Gideon came to Succoth. Now Gideon had all the precise data needed to execute fair and appropriate discipline on this maverick community. The exact list of the leaders must have come as a terrifying shock to Succoth. It was a first knockout blow of special, well-nigh super spiritual insight which stunned the whole community. Well, may they have asked, where did this man obtain such information with such rapidity? Wasn't he away in combat? Did he leave spies planted among us? These and a score of other searching questions must have swept through the dusty village streets. Gideon had come back to scourge them precisely as he had promised to do. Here was no man of mere empty threats. What happened to Gideon in this instance is indicative of what very often takes place in the lives of those who really do Yahuwah's will. I often refer to them as Yahuwah's bonuses. Yahuwah will make available to those who walk humbly with him enormous insights or otherwise unexplainable advantages, which would not otherwise be theirs. He provides guidance, direction, and data ordinarily beyond one's ability to gather or possess. He puts them in positions of enormous advantage. He arranges and coordinates the events of their lives in unique and wonderful ways. It is this element of seeing Yahuwah's hand at work that lends such a keen sense of wonder and excitement to a believer's career. There are no accidents in his activities. He senses with an acute awareness that Yahuwah is very much at work behind the amazing sequence of his affairs. And in this, he not only finds great confidence, but also enormous adventure in his companionship with Yahuwah. This experience is not something unique or restricted only to outstanding men and women of Yahuwah. It can be and often is the daily delight of those whose simple trust is in Yahuwah. As Gideon's men rounded up the 77 shaken leaders of Succoth, they were fully aware that their discipline would be Yahuwah directed. This was not a case of Gideon evening the score for their previous insults to him. It was not a question of taking vengeance or venting his spleen. Nor was it even a matter of getting mad and abusing his indifferent brethren for their cruel callousness to his cause. What Succoth was to be taught on this terrible day was the high cost of riding the fence. They were to see what price one paid for belittling Yahuwah and ridiculing his ability to deliver his own people. They were to learn the agonizing lesson that to be lukewarm was something abhorrent and despicable. Gideon ordered the two shackled desert princes, Zebah and Zalmunna, to step forward before all the villagers. Standing there, stripped of their regalia, no longer mounted on their caparison camels, disheveled and blood-stained, the two princes appeared more like a couple of scarecrows than haughty desert chiefs. "Here are the prizes you taunted me about," Gideon shouted to the trembling crowd, now cowed with fear. "You flung the taunt in my face when I came to you seeking supplies for my men, that Zebah and Zalmunna were not yet in my hand." His eyes smoldered and his voice thundered in terrifying solemnity. "Here they are. See for yourselves. Yahuwah has given both them and the names of your notorious leaders into my power." It would almost be best to draw down a veil over the excruciating details of the appalling lashing then measured out to the men of Succoth. It was a scene repeatedly played out in the cruel life of the cruel Middle East. The victims were forced to lie face down in the dust of their own village streets. Their clothing was stripped away rudely to lay bare their bodies. Then strong men thrashed them unmercilessly with the rough branches of the desert acacias or other scrub thorn. The talons on these branches were sharpened rapiers that tore through flesh and tissue with agonizing pain. Blood and humor gushed from the gaping wounds. It was a ghastly flogging, sometimes consummated by dragging the hapless victim across the rough ground until their skin was shredded from their bodies in excruciating torture. Leaving Succoth to groan in its agony, Gideon and his forces pushed on to Penuel. Perhaps word of their impending punishment sped before the advancing general. Again, Gideon was to demonstrate that he was a man of his word. Even though flushed with victory and exuberant with his conquest, he was not about to forget the formidable decree made to these proud people of Penuel. Perhaps they felt impregnable in their desert fort with its high walls and impressive lookout tower. Maybe they thought they could make light of a man whose trust was in Yahuwah, who claimed that it was Yahuwah who would grant him great victory, and they chided and scoffed at his childlike confidence in Yahuwah. Soon they discovered how suddenly the tables of their lives could be turned when Yahuwah was in the setting. Men do not make light either of Yahuwah or his people with impunity. There ultimately comes an hour of reckoning. There comes a time of truth. There comes a settling of the score. It has always been thus. It will ever be so. Puny men do not lampoon the Almighty without paying an appalling price for their insolence. It matters not whether it be in the case of individuals or nations. So Gideon's forces assaulted and tore down the fortress tower of Penuel. As the walls and parapets of the sun-dried bricks and desert stone came crashing to the ground, the occupants poured out like ants scurrying from their anthill. But their frenzied flight was too late. Their panic did not preserve them. They were put to the sword by Gideon's fierce 300. When the siege and slaughter were over, Gideon marched away, leaving behind a broken town. Its walled fortress flattened, its men dead, its strength shattered. This proud, arrogant village lay open and vulnerable to every raider who passed by. In fact, it would become to all who traversed these desert wastes a byword of the severity of Gideon's ferocious discipline. Even Zebah and Zalmunna looked on askance at their own fierce hearts turned to terror. In the tradition of his times, Gideon returned home to Abiezar with the triumphal panoply of a splendid warlord. In his train came the once fierce Midianite princes, Zebah and Zalmunna. Besides them, there would be a whole host of captive prisoners, young men, pretty girls, and others who would become slaves and servants. As well, There would be caravans of camels bearing booty and loot of every sort stripped from the fallen enemy forces. It was all a part of the cruel business of war. It was the culmination of gory battles and great gallantry. It was the ending to a triumphant engagement. As the conquering heroes came marching home, people would come tumbling out of their homes and villages to sing and shout their adulation. Children would clap their hands and chant praises in gleeful excitement. Farmers would pause in their fields to wave happily with relief. There was jubilation everywhere. The long enemy occupation was over. The Midianite invaders had been overthrown and crushed. Gideon was their national idol. The hero was home. It was probably this public applause, more than any other thing, which began to be Gideon's undoing. Like most men, he would have some difficulty handling success. It seemed to go to his head a bit. Not until he had reached his little familiar farmstead at Ophrah did he start to question and interrogate his two captive chiefs. Rumor had it that they were, in fact, the very ones who had killed his older brothers at Tabor. When pressed closely on this point, both Zebah and Zalmunna admitted to committing terrible atrocities there. In an attempt to curry favor with Gideon, hoping that perchance he might spare their lives, they resorted to flattery. In fact, those we slaughtered were veritable princes, they smiled slyly, oiling their slippery words with characteristic Eastern subtlety. They resembled you, Gideon, sons of a king. Of course, in one sense, Gideon may have felt genuinely flattered by so lofty a compliment. To a degree, it was well deserved. He had conducted himself in battle like royalty. He had commanded his men with consummate skill and courage. He was, in truth, a prince of a man in his own right. He had earned this accolade from his enemies with elan. But Gideon was not about to be bamboozled by such cunning. He was no fool. He was a down-to-earth farm fellow who knew very well where his roots and heritage lay. He came from one of the least respected tribes of Yasharel. His father's clan was one of the least impressive, even though Joash bore a proud name among his people. And all of them together, he and his brothers, were but humble countrymen, struggling to survive on their sparse and marginal properties. But princes? No, not princes. Just plain people who had been brutally plundered and pillaged by these merciless Midianites. Despite the tremendous triumphs of the past few days, despite the incredible victories granted by Yahuwah, despite the aura of honor and esteem in which he now moved, Gideon had not forgotten the grim, grinding, ghastly years underground. He remembered very clearly and very vividly the atrocities perpetrated under the cruel heel of the Midianites. He recalled the calamity, suffering, and sorrow in his family when news came to his home that his own brothers had been brutally massacred by the ruthless desert raiders now standing in chains before him. There were sly smirks on their faces, and it made his blood boil. Their blood would be spilt for his brother's blood. To Gideon's credit, it must be conceded that even in this, his hour of power, he was given to greatness and to generosity. His reply to Zebah and Zalmunna is startling in its striking sincerity. If you had spared my brothers, the sons of my mother, whose heart you shattered, I would spare you. A look of pathos crossed his strong face. But because you did not, your blood must be spilled for theirs. See Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. This edict was Yahuwah's, not Gideon's. It had been so foreordained from the earliest era of his ancestors under Yahuwah's direction. In taking the lives of these two men, He was complying with what had been commanded from time immemorial. But there was more to it than just that. It is important to recognize a powerful principle here. The slaying of the 2 desert warriors, now in his hand, was not cold-blooded revenge for himself. It was an act of justice and retribution on behalf of his father and his mother, who had suffered the loss of their sons. Also, it was a settlement of the score on behalf of his brothers' families, left destitute and distraught by their deaths. Gideon then did a very peculiar thing, perhaps a very cruel thing, certainly a very unbecoming thing. He ordered his oldest son, a mere stripling lad, a gangling, awkward boy in his early teens, to thrust the desert princes through with his sword. It was asking too much of the youngster. Even if he was the son of a now famous father, this was an act beyond his ability. The 2 proud princes also sensed that this was a crude gesture below the character of Gideon. A man of his caliber did not add insult to injury. They were prepared to die, but if die they must, at least it should be with dignity, beneath the fierce sword of a great and gallant fighting man. Gideon saw his mistake. Without a moment's delay or hesitation, he hurled himself at the 2 captives and cut them to the ground. It was the climax to his campaign. He had been the first to raise the sword to overthrow the oppressor. Now he was the last to sheathe it. For 40 years now, he would never again need to draw it from its scabbard. With a last final flourish, Gideon had the golden ornaments and chains stripped from the camels of his captives. It was a signal to all his followers that they could follow suit. The war was over. The spoils were theirs. They deserved recompense for their bravery. This was their grand finale. Chapter 12. Gideon and his gold. From Judges chapter 8, verses 22 through 27. Tremendous excitement commingled with exuberant enthusiasm swept across Yasharel. In the matter of a few desperate days of battle, this nation had undergone an incredible metamorphosis. Emerging from the constricting bondage and darkness of their subterranean existence, they burst into a new life of glittering gaiety like a full-formed butterfly breaking out of its crypt-like cocoon. Yasharel, the nation under Yahuwah, quite literally did want to try her wings. She felt she was in a position now, not only to have shed the shackles of the enemy, but even to step free and clear of the constrictions of the theocracy under Yahuwah. It was really a case of being a bit drunk with power. The esteem of victory and ecstasy of conquest was a heady mixture that most of these downtrodden people could not handle very well. It went to their heads. And is so often the case, they were carried away from the facts of reality in their frenzy. It was Yahuwah who had been with them in battle. It was he who had made right on his commitment to Gideon that he would deliver Yasharel from her dilemma. It was he who had discomfited the overwhelming armies of the Midianites. It was he who had given Gideon the encouragement, leadership, and expertise to execute amazing military strategy. It was he who had provided the energy and inspiration needed for a tiny handful of men to root and overcome a huge enemy force of overwhelming superiority. Essentially, the battle had been Yahuwah's. He was the victor. But in the esteem of that triumph, Yasharel's attention was focused not on Yahuwah, but on Gideon. It was in him that they saw their hero, their hope, their possible first king. Their attention had been diverted from the Yahuwah of their salvation to a mere man. For all of Yasharel, this was a dangerous digression. It might well have led to terrible results and devastating consequences. Fortunately for them, Gideon did not succumb to their mass hysteria. People so often behave like sheep. They move under the impulse of a strange, powerful mob instinct. In a moment, the masses can be gripped with mania. This is an inherent weakness in human society, which individuals hungry for power and obsessed with ambition can manipulate and exploit to their own selfish advantage. Had Gideon so desired in this his hour of triumph, he could have seized the sovereignty of his people. They would gladly, readily have rewarded him with royal acclaim. They would happily have made him their first monarch. He would have been acclaimed their king. He could have established a regal dynasty beginning with himself, carried on through his stripling son, Yether, and eventually on through his grandsons. It would have been a most alluring prospect for most men. To be granted with such enormous power and prestige by one's people was a glittering prospect which lesser men would have grabbed, but not Gideon. His response to this suggestion gives us a remarkable insight into the character of the man. Vehemently he protested, "I shall not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. Yahuwah shall rule over you." It was a simple, straightforward declaration of incredible magnitude. It reveals the genuine humility of the man. He was unassuming, and yet, at the same time, very wise. Obviously, success had not gone to his head. He had retained a calm, collected view of himself and his own inabilities. He had sufficient spiritual maturity to recognize that it was Yahuwah who had granted victory to Yasharel. He still saw the strategy and superior role played by Yahuwah in the life of this nation, and on this account, Gideon insisted that honor be given to whom honor was due. Had the historical record of Gideon concluded at this point, he would stand securely as one of the most remarkable men in the annals of Yasharel. But his story did not end there. Like so many human narratives, it goes on to disclose that, as with all of us, Gideon too had an Achilles heel in his makeup. A remarkable aspect of the scriptural accounts of men and women with whom Yahuwah deals is their utter authenticity. There is never any attempt made to whitewash people. No glossing over of a character is allowed. We see them shown to us in their true colors. It matters not whether it be Moshe, Daud, Hezekiah, or Gideon. They are not portrayed as perfect people living like gilded birds in golden cages. Rather, we see them struggling in the lights and shadows of their own unique makeup, striving against the assaults of sin and selfishness which all of us face in life. So as we look now on this magnificent young man, we sense a sinister shadow stealing across the scene. It is as though his great and noble triumph would be tarnished by tragedy that had its source in his one great weakness: gold. He had not been allured or drawn away by the glitter of kingship, but when it came to gold, the raw, bare, precious element, something deep within his makeup was ignited. An enormous, overpowering desire for sudden wealth, sudden security, sudden spending power engulfed Gideon. He looked on the spoils of war gathered up by his men, and it mesmerized his gaze. He, the poor land farmer from Ophrah, had never seen such wealth. The booty stripped from the Midianites was almost unbelievable. There were gorgeous golden earrings, exquisite necklaces, golden camel chains, Ishmaelite ornaments of all sorts, besides royal purple robes elaborately embellished with gold thread and other lavish trappings common to the fierce camel warriors. What Gideon saw, he wanted, and he wanted it in a very large measure. In fact, he demanded it of every man. There was burning in his bones a covetous craving for every gold earring he could lay his hands on. Surprisingly enough, his wish was granted. The prompt response and immediate reaction of his men was to fling one of the gorgeous royal gowns on the ground. Into it, every man tossed the golden earrings and ornaments stripped from the fallen foe. Again, a sort of mass hysteria swept through Gideon's forces. In glee and jubilant gaiety, they watched the glittering mound of jewelry pile up in a mountain pyramid under the summer sun. Light flashed and sparkled from 1,000 polished surfaces as the earrings and necklaces tumbled on top of one another. It is especially surprising that not a single soldier stopped to ask his commander what would be done with the gold. Not one warrior even questioned the reason behind this otherwise unreasonable demand. In war and victory, every man was entitled to his share of the spoils. Who or what did Gideon have in mind? If we pause to calculate roughly what the value of this accumulated gold was worth, it will astonish us. The weight collected was 1,700 shekels of gold. Translated into our troy weights, this is 70 pounds. At the current price of gold on the world markets, its equivalent value in today's currency would be in the neighborhood of $134,000. In addition to this amount of gold and earrings alone, Gideon was given gorgeous chains, neck ornaments, and royal robes of immeasurable worth. It can be assumed that the total value of all his acquisitions that day easily exceeded $250,000. It was a straightforward case of instant riches. The Dust Bowl farmer had suddenly found himself a fortune. And unfortunately, it was to become his folly. Gideon was by no means the first, nor the last of his race to have problems with the yellow metal. Gold, though such a precious commodity, bears with it its own peculiar burden of bondage. It offers such liberty, yet so often leads its owner into the prison of his own possessiveness. It has the capacity to subvert with appalling consequences those who pursue it. Gideon's forefathers, under the indiscretion of Aharon, had flung their gold at Aharon's feet to have it fashioned into a golden calf. Around this false image, they danced and feasted until Moshe came storming down off the smoking, rumbling mount of Yahuwah. Yasharel's incredible folly brought them within a hair's breadth of utter annihilation beneath the hand of Yahuwah, whom they had so grossly spurned. Again, after the battle of Jericho, Achan had seen the coveted enemy gold and garments. He hid the forbidden booty in a pit dug beneath the floor of his tent. This covert act of direct disobedience led to the discomfiture of Yahuwah's armies when they assaulted Ai. It was a terrible rout for Yasharel. Dismayed and discouraged, Yahusha flung himself on his face upon the ground before Yahuwah. What had gone wrong? It was the glitter of gold that had undone the armies of Yasharel. The magnetism of materialism is insidious and devastating. In the retinue of great kings, who would ultimately follow long after Gideon, gold was to become a terrible trap. Even Solomon, with all his wisdom granted from Yahuwah, could not keep from being subverted by gold. It brought him foreign wives and concubines who led his heart astray to follow false Elohim. Hezekiah, one of the most outstanding leaders ever to arise in Jerusalem, met his nemesis in gold. It inflamed his heart, pandered to his pride, and induced him to display his wealth to the Babylonians. Alternately, they too were gripped with gold fever. They came marching against Jerusalem, stripped both Hezekiah and the gorgeous temple of its gold, then took Yasharel away into captivity. Gideon's handling of gold may have been well-intentioned, yet it was essentially badly mistaken. We are not given the exact details of all that he did with his hoard, just that the bare bones remained in the historical record to remind us that the best of men can be subverted by sudden wealth. He instructed that a gorgeous golden ephod be made. An ephod was the special tunic reserved exclusively for the use of the high priest who served Yahuwah on behalf of his people. As he ministered before the altar in the tabernacle, he wore this gorgeous garment of gleaming blue brocade. It had attached to its shoulder straps the names of the 12 tribes of Yasharel. As the high priest ministered before Yahuwah, interceding for his nation, he bore ever before the ark of Yahuwah the names of his people. During this period in Yasharel's history, the home of the ark, the tabernacle, and the chief high priest was in Shiloh. This was a small village not far from Jerusalem in Judah. And it was there, and only there, that the high priest could minister on behalf of all his people before Yahuwah. Gideon knew this, and so did his family and friends. Yet, somehow the gold now in his possession induced him to do this very naive and foolish thing. It may well be argued that Gideon was endeavoring to try to turn the attention of his people back to Yahuwah. It may have been that the true Levitical priesthood of his time was terribly decadent. It was no doubt his burning desire to see a new impulse and impetus in this spiritual life of Yasharel that led him to have the golden ephod put on display in his hometown of Ophrah. Still, none of these reasons truly exonerated his decision. For though he had been the one who here demolished the power of the false Elohim of Baal and Asheroth, he was really now putting another false idol in their place. Put very bluntly, Gideon was simply substituting one form of false worship with another. He had fallen into the trap of taking away one idol only to put another in its place. This would have been serious enough had it only involved his own immediate family. The tragedy was it enmeshed all of his nation. The whole of Yasharel went astray. The responsibility of moral or spiritual leadership is an enormous burden for any man to bear. It takes a continuous, ongoing, undeviating devotion to Yahuwah to lead others aright. One of the formidable temptations ever presented in believers' work is to have our attention focused upon that which we ourselves have produced or taken up upon ourselves in false honor. Gideon fashioned an ephod of gold, and it became a snare to him, his family, his friends, and his entire nation. It captivated their attention. It took them away from focusing their faith on Yahuwah. To us, looking on from afar, this may appear foolish and absurd. Yet, all too often, we are snared in a similar diversion. In believers' groups, it is not at all uncommon for a group of believers to be completely caught up with the contemporary concepts of their activity or life. Some groups literally idolize their leaders because of pleasing personalities, special charisma, or outstanding gifts and abilities. Others are totally enamored with the actual structure of their temple or society. It may be some magnificent edifice of stone, steel, glass, or timber. Alternatively, it might be the program of the organization, its budget, or its elaborate machinery for producing remarkable statistics. No matter what it is, as long as it appears to spell success, success, people will succumb to its allure. In so doing, very often, Yahuwah, who granted the success, is relegated to second place. This essentially became Gideon's downfall. The golden ephod stood as a constant reminder of his own glittering achievements. It dimmed his clear view and memory of Yahuwah, who had met him under the oak when all he owned was a small kid and one bare bucket of grain. Chapter 13, Gideon's Twilight Years. From Judges chapter 8, verses 28 through 35. In spite of the distraction caused by Gideon's golden ephod, he himself remained a remarkable force in Yasharel for the next 40 years. It is indeed a measure of the man that without either pretense or ostentation, his strong, quiet presence among his people provided a base for peace. He had no need to take power into his hands, nor assume undue authority over his contemporaries. Just being there was a guarantee of his great and yali influence in Yasharel. The overthrow and defeat of Midian had been so complete and so final that never again did they pose even a threat from beyond the Jordan. Not even a remote remnant remained to raise its head again like a desert adder, wounded yet ready to strike. Gideon's unrelenting pursuit into the far reaches and desert waste of the Midianite domain had spelled out their final decimation. Not only had Gideon's vicious victory stilled Midian, but it stood as a grim and awesome warning to any other would-be aggressor who might have had designs on Yasharel. All the enemy nations round about were well aware that the regal line of Yasharel was quietly ensconced in Ophrah. He dared not be disturbed in his den. If he ever was, he would come roaring out again to defend Yasharel from her adversary. The net result was that this peculiar people under Yahuwah, though saved from direct attack from without, gradually began to undergo moral decay from within. Amid their peace and quiet, the insidious forces of spiritual degeneration and moral degradation did their deadly work. It is a strange phenomenon in human society that very often, in serene situations, the most dangerous seeds of retrogression are sown. Sated with peace and prosperity, people seem to become suitable seedbeds for the most insidious sort of softness and sensual preoccupation. It is akin to noxious weeds spreading through the whole wide field of society. Men are literally smothered by sin without a complaint and ruined by the influence of corruption on every side. To a degree, what was happening to all of Yasharel as a nation was also in truth happening to Gideon as an individual. We are given a rather detailed account of his main preoccupation during the twilight years of his life. What we see is a microcosm of the whole pageantry of his people. Gideon had become content merely to return to his home in Ophrah. Of course, he came back a much more wealthy man than when he went away. With his newfound riches, he was in a position to acquire numerous wives and concubines. And from these marriages, there were born to him some 70 sons. He became, in fact, a formidable patriarch in Yasharel. We are given the impression that Gideon's twilight years were tranquil and serene. He lived to the ripe old age, for his time, of about 70 years. His days were always surrounded with the delight of much domestic activity. He was quite obvious a hero not only to his children and grandchildren, but also to the friends and neighbors of his community. No doubt, Gideon's home in Ophrah was more or less the hub of activity for Yasharel as a people. They looked to this great patriarch as their judge, their leader, and their savior. No details are given as to what roles of responsibility Gideon was willing to assume after his great victory over the Midianites, but it must be assumed that he was a man of enormous influence for right in all of Yasharel because of his implicit trust in Yahuwah. At last the day came when in great dignity and honor he was buried in the mausoleum of Joash, his father. It marked the end of an era. It was as if sealing this sepulchre was closing the door on a wondrous chapter in the annals of Yasharel. Gideon's influence for right and for Yahuwah, his majestic magnetism and unique charisma, his leadership and uplift for his wayward people were all buried with him. Most melancholy of all, his devotion to Yahuwah and his faith in Yahuwah of his forefathers was a facet of his life that seemed to have failed to make any enduring impact on Yasharel. When Gideon was gone, these too were gone, buried as it were in the darkness of his own death. No restraining spiritual light or illumination remained to light the path of a people who were determined to plunge back into the blackness of Baal and Ashtaroth. No sooner had Gideon gone underground than all of Yasharel forgot not only him, but also his Yahuwah. It was as if he almost had never been on the center stage of this strange nation's sad and painful story. Few are the races of the earth who have given rise to greater geniuses than has Yasharel. Her story is replete, even down to this very day, with brilliant men and women of enormous gifts and unparalleled abilities. Though a race relatively small in numbers, scattered all across the earth among the nations of the world, Yasharel has produced more than her share of inspiring people and impressive individuals. Yet her history is full of tragic heroes. Gideon was one of these. Gideon was a man who in his finest hour brought great esteem not only to himself, his family, and his nation, but also to his Yahuwah. But by the same measure, he was also a man who in his weaker moments perpetrated great folly, not only for himself, but also for those who followed him. He leaves us with a classic, clear-cut picture of one who knew what it was to walk humbly with Yahuwah in greatness. He leaves us also with the solemn, sobering view of a man who missed the mark when his personal preferences overruled Yahuwah's favorite will for his life. Chapter 14, A Call to Action. The exploits of Gideon have been recorded for us in Yahuwah's word with authenticity and authority. They are more than the mere report of a most remarkable life under the direct guidance of Yahuwah. Stimulating and inspiring as such biographical sketches may be, they demand more than our enjoyment of them. Implicit in this narrative of a man given to Yahuwah is the inescapable compulsion that calls us to action. There is no reason why in the latter half of the 20th century, Yahuwah's Ruach should not call some of us to become equally great men and women of valor. The simple, penetrating truth is that Yahuwah in Messiah, by his favorite Ruach, does come to us surely as he came to Gideon under the tough old oak in Ophrah. He does commune with us. He does challenge us to great exploits. He does call us to bold action in implicit obedience. He does promise us his presence, his power, his perseverance to accomplish the impossible in our tempestuous times. The simple question is, will I respond in a positive way, empowered by him, to do promptly the thing he instructs me to do? If so, then titanic events will take place both in my own life and in the world around me. Definite steps embracing profound principles that lead in that direction can be seen in the pages that follow. You, the reader, can become a modern-day Gideon under Yahuwah's great hand. You can be one to accomplish giant feats for Yahuwah during your life. I here present in precise form the salient truths demonstrated to us in the history of Yahuwah's dealing with Gideon. This will serve both as a reminder and resume of all that has here been written before. 1. Any nation, community, family, or person that compromises with evil faces ultimate catastrophe. 2. The laws of Yahuwah, designed for the well-being of men, if ignored, prove inexorable. They eventually crush those who contravene them. 3. Sinning always leads, eventually, not to laughter and gaiety, but to horrendous suffering. 4. Strange as it may seem, most men will not cry out to Yahuwah for deliverance until crushed. Out of despair comes the call for help. 5. Because Yahuwah is so merciful, so generous, so great-hearted, he never does turn a deaf ear, even to chronic offenders. 6. He is more anxious to deliver us from our dilemmas than we are. Somehow, most of us love the slime pit of sin. 7. The disciplines of hardship and disaster are really a demonstration of Yahuwah's deep love for his own. 8. Amid the darkness and despair of those mired in evil, he comes to help anyone who will respond. 9. He is unable to rescue those who refuse to be restored. If a man is to know Yahuwah's strength, he must respond to it. 10. Yahuwah's great purposes for his people are, more often than not, accomplished through the instrumentality of one man or woman. 11. Yahuwah's relationship to us is a very private, personal one. It is based upon an individual's availability to Yahuwah, not upon any special gift or genius. 12. It matters not how unpromising the person or place may appear from a human perspective. Yahuwah can see the potential. 13. He takes the most unlikely individual to achieve the most remarkable results. 14. The key to such success lies in the implicit compliance of a man with Yahuwah's will. 15. This sort of obedience and prompt cooperation comes at great cost. It entails setting aside one's own wishes. 16. It is self-sacrifice of this caliber which frees Yahuwah's great hand to move mightily in a man's life. He no longer ties Yahuwah's hands nor restricts his ruach. 17. With humble, open, available people, Yahuwah delights to dwell. They are his favorite friends. 18. It is his presence which provides the strength, stability, and serenity needed for great achievements. 19. It is this living presence of Yahuwah's Ruach within who produces peace. He provides the needed guidance and direction for all decisions. 20. The individual who then proceeds to do simply what is asked of him will discover enormous power with Yahuwah. 21. It is Yahuwah himself who energizes and enables a mere man to accomplish enormous exploits. 22. This has far-reaching influence on a person's family, friends, neighbors, community, and nation. It is a contagion. 23. Others will often rally to the call of a person whose life is centered in Yahuwah and not self-centered. 24. There is an inherent need amongst most men for spiritual leadership. They look for it. They gravitate to it when it can be found. 25. The accomplishment of Yahuwah's purposes on this earth is not dependent on large-scale operations. His economy is based not on man's measurements, but on inspired dynamics. 26. One man with Yahuwah can be a majority in any situation. 27. Despite what we may appear to observe around us, Yahuwah is actively and energetically at work behind the scenes. 28. The ongoing enterprises of Yahuwah's Ruach are eternal. In the end, they ultimately prevail despite all that is contrary. 29. It is the wise person who aligns himself in harmony with the will of Yahuwah for the world. To do otherwise is to invite inevitable disaster. 30. For the person who seeks and does Yahuwah's will, there are wondrous compensations and exciting conquest. 31. Victory comes at a high cost. That price is the willingness to be seen as a fool for Yahuwah. 32. Yahuwah is ever faithful to those who follow him. He never devil deals anyone who is loyal. He honors them. 33. The awareness of Yahuwah's special touch upon one's life brings to it special dignity and direction. 34. The presence of Yahuwah's own merciful spirit injects patience and perseverance into a man's performance. He is energized with amazing endurance. 35. Similarly, the person who walks humbly with Yahuwah is given unusual tact and insight in dealing with difficult people. 36. A certain but sure sense of gratitude engulfs a person who knows the hand of Yahuwah is on him. 37. There is an acute awareness that the Ruach of Yahuwah provides opportunities and insights otherwise not available. 38. These bonuses from Yahuwah lend great delight and joy to a life lived for Yahuwah. 39. Amid even the most exalted spiritual experiences, there ever lingers the possibility of lapsing into sin. 40. The world and its allurements are ever with Yahuwah's people. It requires eternal vigilance to guard against the allurements of our society and culture. 41. Even the best of men can fall prey to some insidious weakness in their makeup. 42. The ongoing effect of a Yali life has an impact far beyond our fondest imagination. It is the impress of a spirit that has been controlled by the Ruach of Yahuwah. Like a pebble dropped in a quiet pond, its waves of influence extend to the extremity of its periphery. 43. Yahuwah has ordained that no person live as an island to himself. Our actions extend across the ages. 44. Only what a man lets go does Yahuwah ever get. 45. Spiritual courage, under Yahuwah's control, carries its own great contagion. 46. It is not enough merely to destroy in the name of Yahuwah. He expects that something more noble and enduring shall be erected in its place. 47. A man under the control of Yahuwah's Ruach is a formidable force for right in the world. 48. Few are the true peacemakers who may be highly honored with the title Child of Yahuwah. 49. Yahuwah's people do not deign to add insult to injury. Their words are weighted in honesty and sincerity. 50. The supreme secret to a serene walk with Yahuwah lies in immediate obedience to his directives. The life of Gideon, a simple countryman, comes down to us across the centuries, undiminished in impact. He was a man who gave himself to Yahuwah. In turn, Yahuwah has given him back to us for example, encouragement, and splendid inspiration.